sound about.
It is my utmost pleasure
Is it why is it mono?
Yeah, no. Distinguished guests,
Why
an
is it become
esteemed
mono?
member of our International Advisory Council, a true icon in international politics, a tireless advocate for democracy, peace, and gender in Africa and beyond. As the first woman ever to be elected to lead an African nation and a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, President Johnson Sirleaf has shattered numerous barriers. We are truly honored to have you, Your Excellency, and we're all eagerly waiting to gain insight into Her Excellency.
Confirm to you that the courtesy of coming on this training and seeing this place is just wonderful. And I think coming to Accra is the best place to be if you want to see a wide spectrum of different things in nature at its best. Let me thank you, Mr. CEO. I have indeed visited several meetings of Afrobarometer, either because of you, the planning committee, who will be at work in the next few days, ensuring that the future work of the institution will also be able to carry on in satisfactory development. With the continent experiencing significant economic growth and development, data has become an essential tool for policymakers and development practitioners wishing to track progress, identify ways for intervention, and make informed decisions that can impact the lives of millions of people. However, despite the importance of this in utilizing timely data, these challenges have hindered the continent's ability to effectively monitor progress, identify gaps, and take corrective action as needed in resources, the misallocation of resources, and the perpetuation of inequalities. One of Africa's biggest challenges regarding taking timely data is the lack to be able to put them out in a timely manner and to have them regarded for the importance that they represent. Collect, manage, and analyze data effectively. This has led to data ability to delays, to severe consequences for policymakers and government practitioners. Similar challenges face the continent in the lack of culture of data-driven decision-making. Instead, many African policymakers and practitioners still rely on intuition, anecdotal evidence, and personal experience to make decisions. The misalignment between policies and actual need always results is being made in many areas. For example, there is increasing recognition of the importance of data in the continent of African development, and many organizations and their institutions are investing in building the necessary infrastructure and the capacity to collect and analyze data on time. We need not look far to see the example of this Afrobarometer. For over 30 years, 20 years, let's put it up there, 10 years ago. For over 20 years, I've been conducting general aptitude surveys across the continent. Your work is of great importance because valuable data on public opinion, political attitudes, and socioeconomic issues critical for policymakers, for CEOs, for researchers, and other populations across the continent. Your work helps inform evidence-based decision-making of African citizens. Identify areas of improvement and hold government accountable for their action. While promoting transparency and accountability, your work helps to strengthen democratic institutions and promote political stability in our continent. It is thus benefiting to know that Afrobarometer quality data reporting has created a partnership institution with the RIAG that tracks incidences of African government with the Mo Abraham Foundation. Similarly, African government's participation, many of you may know, in the peer review system at the African Union, such as the African Development Bank, to guide countries on performance individually and comparatively to the achievement of national development and leader up for women leadership in public governance.
Yeah, thumbs up.
The first of its kind, it is an initial effort to report data on ECOWAS countries on elected and appointed positions of women in executive and parliamentary positions. A database has been dedicated to harnessing the power of data to inform advocacy and policy making that will advance women's representation in public governance. Following the launch of the West Africa section of the platform, data gathering for Eastern Africa is underway and will be launched. We hope to develop a dashboard colorful images to inspire and motivate women and men on the importance of women's and democratic government. But the story of data adequacy in Africa is not totally positive. Although we all have tried so hard to see this as the basis for an institution, we have seen many national and regional research continue to face decline in too many of our countries. We have seen too many of our countries, particularly those of low capacity institutions, to provide the data which is required for policy action. Too often, the need of urgency in data leads to back-of-the-envelope calculations for the statistics required nation asset, a Ghana-based institution. We have engaged the World Bank to address this issue by providing the support required to provide national leaders with an independent source of evidence-based data to support their decisions. This has not yet happened, but such engagement must continue as we work in a world that is different today as equity and in leading the effect of economic decline and devastation. For many of the lower middle income countries, this is manifested in the debt crisis that has undermined progress in several countries which continue to work with institutions such as the G20 and G7 through SDR reallocation for capital punishment. We also know that other challenges of our fragmented world today, strong international effort to address the peace and security now We see Afrobarometer take a stronger stand and a stronger role in ensuring to the public the data that's essential, but more important, perceptions that come from the people. Because it's those perceptions that generally guide the actions of people who are the ones that are affected or those implemented. They will create new impetus for the phenomenal work which we do. As we move toward an African that is seeking regional integration, as we move toward the decision we have taken that for ensuring that our regional capacities are strengthened, so that our commercial work, the African capacity, will enable to be. This is what our African Union called for, and I believe will to. Before concluding, let me acknowledge another aspect of your work that is dear to my heart. That is the work of Afrobarometer and all of you who now will be working with the Planning Committee. Equality. The quality institutions like Afrobarometer, because you have created a platform for African citizens, culture of transparency. So as you deliberate recognition that you of what you have done to improve the recognition and acceptance of data, and on the task that you will face ahead as Africa works along with others in this very as to achieve national goals. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much, President Johnson-Sirleaf, for your inspiring and insightful remarks. Your message of hope and optimism, despite the challenges, remind us that data has the power to make a difference. Data is an essential tool, it's a critical tool, and we heard your call for to produce timely data for evidence base with this audience today. Within Ghana's
Good morning, everybody. Your Excellency, President Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, former President of the Republic of Ghana, Your Excellency, Professor Jima Boedi, juncture to convey the apology for opening remarks. It is an honor to be part of the opening ceremony of the planning meeting of the Pan-African Institute for the year 2023, the first form to greater governance. Afrobarometer, including Ghana, the realities and preferences of her people have been brought to bear through the outcome of surveys, which is a shining example of how research and data content could be utilized to transform our society and to meet the needs and aspirations of the people. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, there is no gainsaying that research and development are indispensable tools that could be deployed in the implementation of policies towards the achievement of flagship programs, including the African Union through decentralization, leads to citizen participation and regular interface between the elected local government representatives. Undoubtedly, decentralization increases the quality of especially in governance and economic empowerment. I must say that the Afrobarometer's knowledge sharing through through research in areas of democracy, governance, and economic development, have influenced policies and programs by the various sharing of democratic experience, with increasing for greater inclusiveness, have been impacted positively by the work of Afrobarometer, of parliamentary friendship associations, and the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, with the active representation of people, in my view, also strengthens the foundation of democratic governance in Africa. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the Planning Committee is taking place at a time of global uncertainties, exacerbated by post-COVID era and the Russian-Ukraine war, which adversely adopting the meeting, therefore, has a unique opportunity to refocus its work on sustaining economic gains made by African countries in the area of mobilization, digitalization, skills development, the private sector, and small and medium enterprises. The sub-region in recent times has witnessed a threat or threats to peace and security, the overall development of the continent. The acts of piracy in the Gulf of Guinea, maritime insecurity, violent extremism and terrorism, as well as constitutional breaches in West Africa, call for global partnership in support of initiatives by governments, the African Union, ECOWAS, to address confronting us. Ghana, as an active member of the international community, peacekeeping and prevention, and the interrelated issues of terrorism, climate change, the efforts of policymakers, opinion leaders, and academia to sensitize the general public on topical issues such as climate change, the transition to green economy, energy and food security, and capacity building for media personnel and the youth to enhance democratic space. Afrobarometer is intrinsically linked to the regional integration agenda being pursued by the Afrobarometer has proven to be part of the fabric of democratic development and governance through the quality of their work. I look forward to a set of surveys to be conducted on the continent. In conclusion, I would like to quote Nelson Mandela. Quote, "As we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same," unquote. It therefore places an inherent responsibility and obligation on us to share with others the path our country has trailed, with the expectation that it would contribute to consolidate.
Shift gear and start part of the official program, where we hear from our co-founders, Professor Jima Boades, Dufu to take a front row seat, and gentleman Mattis Bratton, if you can join us on the podium. As you do that, I would just say that our data from 34 African countries show that almost 6 in 10 from the youth. I can tell you that this is certainly not the case for Afrobarometer, and that's why it is my pleasure and privilege to hand over my moderator's duty to a young voice of, from Afrobarometer, our capacity manager, Dominique Driding. She will be leading the discussions during that panel. I thank you for your attention.
And to echo all the welcomes, to really take a moment just by the magnitude and grandeur of this planning meeting, and to take a moment to really reflect on how far we've come. And who better need any introduction, but I'm joined with Prof. Mattis to my right, Prof. Mike Batten to my left, and Prof. Jima also to my left. My first question is to you, Mike. How did you, I'm sure everybody, all three of you will have a slightly different version of events, but how did you meet, and what really informed your decision to start Afrobarometer and really start conducting these multi-country surveys?
Be here. We will, I'm sure, have different recollections of how things started. I think that we first met in 1998 at the Center for Policy Studies in Braamfontein, Johannesburg, at a concert in doing research on public opinion. I had been working in Zambia since about 1994, doing public opinion surveys. I heard that Bob had been working throughout the Southern African region. I knew that Jima, through in Ghana, undertaker being of democratic space across the world. There were opportunities here to be taken that hadn't existed under the one-party and military regimes that had previously prevailed in Africa. So we were in the right place at the right time, I think, to start this work. Whether those situations, whether that situation prevails today is something we might want to reflect back on and ask how we need to adjust our work due to changed circumstances. But at least at the beginning, it looked like a promising time to start.
Thank you so much. Bob, I'm going to move to you. With all the opportunities that were available in the 1990s that sort of led to the creation of Afrobarometer, looking back, what were some of your greatest struggles really setting up this network and during those early years of Afrobarometer?
Based in the United States. And their comments were something like, well, why would you do this anyway? Everybody knows that the national boundaries are kind of meaningless, and the real differences are between men and women and rural and urban people. And secondly, people won't tell you what their opinions are. And thirdly, I think the first two things were fairly easily dismissed early on. The capacity issue has always been really the hardest struggle, more of their colonial legacy dating back from the United Kingdom. Not a very strong tradition in doing surveys and quantitative research, especially outside of economics. So in the social sciences, just not having the supply of people to do the kind of work. So right from the start, we knew action was, sorry, what's the word? Process, and a slow process, but one that is moved in a very consistent upward direction of building capacity, not only to conduct the surveys, but to actually use the data and say something meaningful to policymakers in people's own countries.
Thank you. Prof. Jima, having reflected on some of the challenges that you have experienced to get Afrobarometer to where it is right now, looking back at that evolution of Afrobarometer, what are you most proud of?
But if you force me to choose one, it's to get back to the point my colleagues have made. What inspired, what motivated us? For me, it was largely the democracy activist in me, because the idea that for years, the ordinary African thinks, what Africans generally feel about things, academics in particular had argued for years that given how hard-pressed lives were in Africa, given the concern with livelihood and so on, people would be interested in democracy. They were not interested in human rights and freedom. They preferred all that they do to be part of a project else, a set of countries that were, when sometime in 2000, and it conveyed to me a sense that Africans have begun to reclaim their voice from those who pretended to speak on their behalf. And that for me was the best part of all. There are other memories that I can share, but I think this for me.
If you'd asked me in 1998 whether we'd be sitting here in 2023, I would have said, perhaps in my wildest dreams. It is very gratifying to see how Afrobarometer has grown and evolved. I mean, it started out as a very loose research network, a handful of people who are interested in research on democracy from below. But it's taken strides, most recently over the last 5 to 10 years, with a foundation in that respect, that Afrobarometer is a household name. It makes me realize that we're much more than a formal organization, that it's become something with a life of its own. And for me, that's tremendously gratifying, and in fact is way more than I ever expected.
Thank you so much. I think that deserves a round of applause. Of course, I think all of us have experienced how Afrobarometer has grown over the years. But looking back, is there anything, and I'm going to start with Prof. Jima and then move to Prof. Mattis, but is there anything you...
That's probably the only question to which I would have a single answer that probably no.
Fortunate in uncovering the wealth of talent that there is around the continent. People who've stepped forward and shown us what they're capable of network, we wouldn't be where we are today.
Great. I think that's really encouraging. Barometer for 4.5 to 5 years now, and even in the short time that I've been around, our growth has been exponential. So I'm sure with our founders sitting here, the whole experience of getting to this decades and a bit.
Maybe in my wildest dreams, but I'd have to say this is beyond my wildest dreams. I think at most I would have hoped for the continuation of and myself being an academic, an academically oriented small research project of partners who got together, university-based, because that's usually what I do and how I think about things. But the fact of this growing into such a large enterprise, and indeed an institution, and an African institution that not only produces data for scholarly analysis, but for policy-making guidance and to hold governments accountable. We beyond is also
found was the most important surprise for me, because once we hit 3 data points, it became possible now to do trend analysis. And coincidentally with that, The Economist magazine, April 1, 2004, did a write-up on data findings for the year, albeit under the cantankerous Economist type heading, Confused Democrats. but nonetheless, that still helped to make the point that now Afrobarometer was studies, and maybe was based for me, was a big subjective or the possibility of funding this growing operation to 35 countries between rounds. Round 4, that was done, I must admit, largely 54 countries. We want to use your data, we like your data, but you cover only 20 countries. We need you to move to a minimum of 33 countries, roughly two-thirds of the countries of the continent, for us to be able to use your data in this operation. I'm glad we took up the challenge. I'm glad my colleagues agreed for us to take up the challenge. And so with that, we moved to 35 countries in round 5, 36 countries in round 6 and beyond. And that was important. But capacity to challenge ourselves, this capacity to rise from a low 20 countries to 35 countries. But it also said something about the Afrobarometer that, we should aim high, and we would always succeed. And I think the new leadership has continued in that vein, and that's a pleasant surprise. I'm not done, and now moving from 35 countries to almost 39 countries in the pleasant surprises that have greeted us in this enterprise.
Looking to the future, I think one of the biggest challenges Afrobarometer is going to have is to manage change. The speed of change in the world is accelerating all the time. It seems to me that kind of spirit that we must constantly change to survive in this in the world that's coming. It's not only a matter of adapting to new technologies, but also the challenge of maintaining our humanity in a context where violence is increasing around the world and impinging upon the borders of the very place that we're sitting session. And of course, the accession of Joe to becoming CEO is the symbol of that in Afrobarometer, and we need to do more of that. The new generation needs to take it up and make it non-profit organizations, and that's the founders syndrome, where the founders fail to realize that their time has come and it's time to hand it over to the next generation. And I just want to let you know that the board has been aware of this, and so we have, in writing our constitution, put in place a provision that a board member may only serve a 3-year term once renewable. In other words, 6 years before passing the torch on to somebody else. And we're doing that fully conscious that leaders, wherever they are, shouldn't serve more than 2 terms in office. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Prof. Bradley. You did preempt my final question. As we...
If you permit me, instead of a message, I will give 2 messages. first message, draws from a very important episode in the life of the Afrobarometer. So I earlier on talked about how we had grown from covering 20 countries to 35 in round 5, 36 in round 6. So that's roughly 2016. We're now planning for round 7. We are brimming with confidence that we can conquer the world. Our funders had promised that they will certainly fund us. Suddenly, we found ourselves hitting a severe financial storm. Our planning meeting for round 7, I think in Tanzania or so, and instead of a planning meeting and a celebration such as this one, it almost was like a funeral, because at that meeting, we had to announce the financial predicament in which we found ourselves. We had to make contingency plans, including cutting back from 35 countries, 36 countries, down to 15, if needs be, cutting salaries, cutting staff, all the things you need to do to save a sinking ship. So that was the situation in which we found ourselves by the time we left Dar es Salaam. Then I get to Nairobi at Jomo Kenyatta Airport in transit. As soon as I come into Wi-Fi mode, a message comes, and it's from the Hewlett Foundation offering $1 million support for the Afrobarometer's work. And from there on, and before then, CEDA Sweden had also said, well, we know your situation, we understand, and we want to help. So they also offered an increase in funding from what it was to something like three times over a 5-year period instead of a 3-year period. And others we didn't know at all. And a group called the Wellspring Foundation in the United States, unsolicited, provided $200,000 funding to help us, address whatever challenges we needed to address in order to essentially survive. That's the Open Society in law. You started coming. We got some individuals who I didn't know before, never met, who came and offered assistance. But that's all to say that the work we do is expensive, and the work we do is to do it with integrity. There's always help around the corner, and somebody comes. So doing the work well, doing it with high quality commitment you all have been demonstrating is a good way to go. That for me is a guarantee of sustainability.
Thank you so much. Prof. Mattis?
I would just to touch back on some of the things that Jeeman and Mike had mentioned before. Really, I think the challenges are, as Mike mentioned, this is a very different world now than 1999. And the sense of optimism has been replaced by a sense of foreboding of growing dysfunction of democratic systems, increasing sentiment for populist and authoritarian government, and then just the rising cost. The cost of doing the real challenge is that one can start thinking about moving to telephones and online methods, but often those are far shorter interviews. And that would be a huge cost. We would lose the long conversation that we have with people. So thinking about how to maintain that with the changing cost structure, the changing political and digital.
Of course.
You offered me the opportunity to give 2 messages. I believe I gave only 1. So Mike just said about the importance of leadership transition. But just when I sit back now, as somebody who was closely involved with the enterprise for over 20 years, still through that to successfully, and also I should have retired much earlier, that this Afrobarometer would have made more progress than the huge again, the important.
Thank you so much for those words of wisdom. I know that we don't often get this opportunity to be in the same room as each other, but also as the founder. So if you could please.
Data management for Afrobarometer. I have a question for everyone with regards to the Afrobarometer book that was released. I think it was around 3 or 4. I think when I first met Mike a couple of years back, I was still a master's student, and the first thing I told potential approval using the Afrobarometer data, and Bob was my supervisor at the time.
Is there anybody who has a question on their minds? Okay, while those questions are brewing, I will...
If there is to be a part 2, we won't be the ones writing it. I'm encouraged that Joe has put so much emphasis on outreach to African universities, because I think the next book should come out of that relationship. I'm sure there are scholars across the continent who could get together, and it doesn't need to be a single-authored book. In fact, I think it would be better if it were an edited volume in which there were contributions from universities in every corner of the continent.
No?
Yeah, what he said.
Okay, sure. So I think that's an invitation for us to take up the mantle. We have another question from Mr. Dagger.
Thank you. I just want to bring a contribution which goes to what Professor Boagi said earlier, to set up Afrobarometer, coming from the perspective of actually getting data, getting a reflection of reality through data. Well, you've seen my gray hair. I come from, since 1975, from the continent. But we came only from the perspective of academia, from whatever we could then, doing our research and publishing papers every 2 years in our biennial conference, from simply an own perspective aids, to now have a tool to be able to provide analysis. So that juncture, as you just said, from what the fantastic work that Afrobarometer is doing, that link back to academia, to researchers, and especially to bringing young researchers to use that tool to reflect and to be part of the activism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dagger. And Mr. Dagger.
What he said in some of the academic circuit around Africa, and you run into people, and also in Europe and America, and you run into people, Africans don't like, are happy with their chieftaincy, they are happy with their monarchs. This democracy thing is enough. Listening it to many Africans, so they think. And that, for me, was a constant delight, just to be able to push back on people's presumptions and wrongful assumptions with real data.
I'm quite surprised that there aren't many, many more questions.
My name is Peter Kellner from London. Jima, you talked just now about data to push back against people's assumptions. In 24 years, what assumptions of yours have been surprised by something I found? Can you think of, in 24 years, where Afrobarometer has come up with information you really weren't expecting?
Would you like to take that?
About democracy. Traveling in a place like, for example, Malawi, lots of very heavy rural population. Traveling around, my sense was, what does democracy mean to these people? What can it really mean? Still stands 25 years later. Their ability to offer meaningful opinions about what was going on in the long way, personal observations and anecdotes that the method that we were applying and allowing people to speak for themselves was just really...
Do you have anything to add?
I share the view, the position that Bob has put on the table. But I also wanted to say that, yes, I've been quite surprised by the level of social tolerance have shown tolerance of other religions, tolerance of people from other ethnic groups and the like. It's almost been a big surprise to me, and the surprise. Educated people, young people, yes, the needle changes only slightly, and that I think is quite an issue for me. Then there is also the matter of differences across cross-country differences. You know that we are used to thinking of the colonial boundaries as artificial. Across Africa, one of the more consistent differences you find will be whether the respondent lives in a francophone African country or the colonial boundaries, unfortunately.
Back?
About Mbuso from Eswatini is or should be an essential component of every advocacy leader and every policymaker's toolbox. And so the question then is, how do we improve or increase engagement with this data that we've been collecting since '99? You know, Professor Jima alluded to the, purport to know exactly what people want, but is it really data driven? So how do we improve the engagement?
Thank you, Mbuso. Before we, yes, Friedlin.
And thank you as well. I echo thanks from everyone. So my question, I'm Fredlin from representing Sierra Leone, Fredlin Okumak Hale. And you've mentioned, all of you have talked a bit about what you want to see. And I just wanted to ask if you could just sum up.
Do we have one more question on the floor? Yes, please go ahead.
Our last is, and you're looking forward to this to protect the Afrobarometer. Thank you.
Historically, one of the greatest challenges, I mean, the question was asked earlier, and I didn't really think of this, but one of our other greatest challenges was simply, I mean, quite early on, I think we were able to, in civil society briefings, taken some important steps, a warmer relationship of open discussion on an ongoing basis of results between local scholarly communities using our data and national governments and national policymakers and planners would really be a very positive development if we can figure out the ways to make that a very routine process.
Well, I'll say what I wanted to say, but something that Bob has said, makes me wonder whether, we've also been seeing in Western democracies, including as some, something inimical, something to be denigrated and so on. So something that I thought was only an African policymaker problem seems to be more for a politics that takes facts seriously, that takes data seriously, instead of fanciful thinking or trying to present fake view, fake data. The thing about my expectation and my hope for Afrobarometer for the next 30 years, I hope that in the next 30 years, if any African president gets up and says, well, my people love me so much, they want me to stay on for another term and another term, somebody will act in your country.
It's an ongoing challenge to interest policymakers enough that they will apply research findings. And about taking a horse to water, but finding it difficult to demand here for civil society. I think in advocating for their interests with government, making use of Afrobarometer data is a way to help us get Afrobarometer's foot in the door with national governments. So I would urge all of you who work with CSOs to redouble your efforts and your training.
Thank you so much. We've got time for 2 more questions. So are there any more burning questions on the floor before we take a tea break with our founders? No? Yes, please go ahead.
My name is Nozipo January Badul, and I'm from South Africa. I'm a member of the board. One thing that worries me is about despite, and to what extent, is it just about the democratic process, or is it also about the outcome? And in that regard, how do we deal with that data? And then how do we see ourselves as Afrobarometer deal with that data going forward? Because it really is worrying. Just putting your vote into a box or your ballot paper into a box is a democratic process, but the outcomes are very, very worrying. Thanks. Brexit being a typical example, and I'll go beyond Africa.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I think
one main outcome is simply people's ability to sustain decent livelihoods. And we measure that quite a lot in terms of people, how often people go without basic necessities of life, their access to, and an improvement in living standards, a reduction of what we call lived poverty, which is a simple index of how often people go without clean water, cooking fuel, etc. And it was no coincidence, and I think this is supported by the broader comparative literature of political scientists on the relationship between democracies and development. And with the big exceptions of places like China and maybe Rwanda, democracies almost always outperform undemocratic countries in delivering these things. And again, I think it's no coincidence that since then, with the of that, and I think it goes back to issues of lack of accountability. Right? So when leaders are held accountable, even if in one-party states that have strong rules about the leader only staying for 7 years, such as Tanzania had for many years until recently. Right? Then in a one-party dominant state, the leader rotated, broken down now, and I think that those are having tangible consequences.
To go back to Peter Kellner's question, one of the things that has surprised me in the Afrobarometer data is the durability of popular support for democracy. We had expected in the early days that there might be a flush of enthusiasm for democracy that would fade. 5 years is how well the indicators of support for democracy have held up. Now, having said that, so not only about the capacity of democratic governments to deliver food and standards of living, but we're also talking about the capacity of worried that that's an issue that is going to undermine democracy in a way that the lack of economic development has not undermined democracy to the extent that we first thought it would. Quite how we address that, I don't yet know, but I think the questionnaire committee ought to be thinking hard about how from.
Thank you so much. I think that brings this particular session to a close, and I'd like please please remain where you are. We are going to move now into a tea break, but that will be sort of done simultaneously with the photo shoot. And Dr. Sunka to please join the co-founders on the stage for a photograph. The second photograph, while they're making their way on stage, could the board members and the IAC members please join the group on the stage, and then finally all the core partners can join them thereafter. This will be followed by a photograph which will be taken outside, just in the interest of space, with everybody in the room, including all our national partners. Thank you.
It looks like we are out of the break.
Can our COO, the Afrobarometer directors, and all core partner representatives please join the stage? Yes. So that is our COO, Afrobarometer. While the final photos are being taken, last but certainly not least, I would like to invite all our national partners and staff to join the stage. And our photographer will direct you in terms of how to position yourselves in height order. I see some staff stragglers at the back. Are you going to be joining us for the picture?
Afrobarometer staff, please stay behind, don't leave. We're taking the pictures with the directors and everyone else in front. Just a lot of. So, core partner, secretariats, supporting units, Afrobarometer core partners, the secretariats, the supporting unit, and the directors.
These core partners.
Okay.